Lavawall is pretty automatic for most users. However, if you need to set up some manual settings, those are available for you too. The way you get the Lavawall configuration from another menu is to click the Lavawalls menu, then choose your location. Some managed service providers prefer to use their clients as locations instead. Then choose the Lavawall device that you've set up and choose Device Settings. Now the top part of this menu is for the location, and this includes the contact information and how we'll respond to alerts. So your company name can't be changed, but you can move your Lavawalls among different locations. Set up your phone number and your email address and select how you would like to be contacted. Now Lavawall has a lot of alarms and alerts built into it, so you can choose when to be contacted. All devices are set up by default to contact you if a client or you click the help button. That'll send you an email with some quick links and ability to solve some problems yourself, but also to be able to contact your clients if they're having problems. One of the key features that we use is notifications when a new machine is connected to the protected network. This is one of the options that's available especially for PCI SAQ-C clients who need to be able to identify any rogue devices plugged in the network, but it's really useful for anybody else too. Some clients prefer to turn off this notification for when new devices are connected to the unprotected network, depending on how big they are and what kind of networks they have. However, for smaller clients, it's really useful to know if an unauthorized device is plugged in. For example, if somebody brings in a laptop that doesn't have antivirus, it's good to be able to know, and then you can call your client right away and say, hey, a new machine's connected, would you like me to look at this for you? We also have honeypot features on all the different networks, as well as the ability to be able to detect any unauthorized connections. So most users like to keep this enabled for detecting any kind of threats on their protected network. And some, of course, like to have it on their external network as well. Some don't if they're in a larger setting or they have a lot of unauthorized users on the network, for example, a guest network. We don't suggest putting a Lavawall right on the gateway. We like to have our Lavawalls put in to the inside of a NAT firewall or NAT router so it's not hitting all the internet traffic. Otherwise, you get a whole bunch of alerts because there's all kinds of attacks happening on the internet at all times. Now, one of the options that you can't disable, of course, is when hacking or worms detected on the honeypot network, because that's the whole point of a honeypot network. We do have some heartbeats coming in and notifications and checking for new setting changes coming in from your Lavawall. So if we don't receive a couple of those, then we'll assume that your Lavawall has lost its internet access, and we can send you a notification for that as well. And of course, we can also send you a notification when you log in the console. Given that all managed service providers are required to use multi-factor authentication, it's quite rare that we have an unauthorized access to the console. However, it's always a good idea to know when it's accessed, just in case something does go wrong. 3Shield also offers security news emails and alerts for new threats in the environment, and some like to have those, some don't, but we don't enable that by default. So if you're using these settings, of course, for all your Lavawalls in one location, you can copy it to automatically default to those, or you can also set them up for your entire company. Now for the specific device settings, the product key is the sticker on the back of the device. You can also give it your Lavawall a nickname. In this case, we've used cash register because it's right behind a cash register. Most Lavawalls are used in credit card mode, which establishes a NAT to protect the inside of the network and also defaults to not allowing any incoming traffic except for related traffic to outgoing requests. And if you have the credit card mode enabled, then of course it asks for credit card processor and other information to set up firewall rules automatically. These aren't enabled, of course, for server mode. So for your credit card processor, we have a whole bunch available already. If you have a new processor, we're adding them all the time as time goes on. We like to know the beginning of your workday and the end of your workday because the Lavawalls are automatically updated as needed. Now, we tend not to do giant firmware upgrades that make the Lavawalls unavailable for a long time. However, if we're updating one of the components that needs a security update or any other kinds of needs, we like to do them outside of your workday. So typically, we wait for a little bit after your workday and then send the updates to your Lavawall. Now, the heartbeats that I mentioned during business hours, we'll send any logs that we need, for example, any new devices that are connected to the network, any unauthorized connections, and typically we can do these less frequently on the off hours because you don't need a notification that you've lost internet access, for example, at 11 p.m. or 2 a.m. Sometimes we will automatically increase this frequency for you. If you have, for example, a lot of unauthorized connections, we don't want to run out of memory on the Lavawall, and so we'll dump them without losing the information on the server by increasing your frequency. However, that is fairly rare. Now, the easy way to automatically configure your Lavawall is to select what each port does. This is a default configuration for a 3-port Lavawall. Of course, if your Lavawall only has 2 ports, you'll only see WAN and LAN 1 or WAN and Ethernet 1. Typically, the second port is used for additional services like an isolated network, for example. However, by default, we assume that you're going to be using the Ethernet connected to WAN and the credit card machine on LAN 1. And so we disable the second one until you actually need it. If you need to have an isolated network, for example, on LAN 2, we can set that up. That's often used if you have a credit card machine, for example, on LAN 1, and then you need to have your sales or inventory management on LAN 2. One of the other features that is new in the last couple of versions is to add a second honeypot port. So you can use the WAN to be a honeypot, which would check for any external traffic. You only use that, of course, if you're on the inside. Most companies like just to have a straight WAN port on that side because your credit card information, of course, is going out. So you'll get a warning, actually, if you set it up that way. But you can set up your honeypot to be on LAN 2. And so what this usually looks like is that we'll have the WAN setting going to your router, your credit card machine plugged into LAN 1, and on LAN 2, we'll have that also plugged in to your external network as well. However, the honeypot network is completely isolated from the credit card network and from the WAN port. So that means that if anything ever goes wrong on the honeypot, which we've never had happen, but out of an abundance of caution, it's completely isolated, and so we don't have to worry about having any traffic leaking over. So these icons, by the way, depend on your location and your region. For example, in North America, we have the North America globe. If you're using a different browser, these icons are actually based on the HTML set, so these actually are rendered differently on different browsers, but they generally convey the same type of information, and that's also why we include the legend. So for most users, we'll have your WAN port being used with DHCP, so you don't have to worry about setting your external IP address or a gateway. It sets up automatically for you. However, if you need to have a static IP address assigned, you do have that flexibility. However, keep in mind that because the device is configured through the internet, it does need to have internet access. So if you set it up with a static IP address and it isn't able to access the internet, it'll try to revert back to using DHCP to make sure that it can get that connection. So if you do have a problem, it's just a matter of really unplugging it and plugging it back into a server that does have DHCP, like even a home firewall router, and then you can gain access to it again. So VLANing tagging isn't really that common. By default, we have it as untagged. But you are welcome, of course, to set up VLANs if they're required for your environment. And the Ethernet 1, because that is typically set as a for your devices, we'll typically just assign that an IP address and then serve that out through a built-in DHCP server. So if your credit card machine is using a DHCP client, it'll automatically take that IP address. However, for some reason, if you have a DHCP server on that network as well, then we can also set that up to be using DHCP instead. And because in this case we're set up as a honeypot, then Ethernet 2 is set to be able to use the DHCP server that's plugged into that network. And of course, when you copy these settings for your locations, it's generally for this information, and the actual IP addresses, of course, aren't duplicated. So you can look at the authorized machines that you have on your network in a separate menu item or on this page as well. These are typically used because we have a credit card machine, for example, and another device might be connected as well. So we can just delete the records if you want them, but say that you had this as your credit card machine and then you have a second machine that's added, you can modify them and authorize that new server to be connected as well. And that was actually a notification as well that we do have an idle timer. So I guess I was talking a bit too long on there and it popped up, and that resets to 100 seconds. So we also have firewall rules that are set up based on the settings that you used above. In most cases, they'll never actually really need to be used. So we have rule types set up, for example, for PCI that are set to only allow related traffic coming in from the outside, so no incoming traffic except for related traffic, of course, when you send a transaction to a credit card processor, for example, and that same thing, it'll go back and forth. And similarly, that will have information coming in from your credit card terminal and then going out to your credit card processor that you chose above. And if we have a honeypot, that is a completely separate set of rules that will set up a whole bunch of fake servers and fake services, and then we'll detect any kinds of SYN scanning or attempts to connect to vulnerable services that we often see, like remote desktop on port 3389, for example, or file shares, SSH, FTP, those kind of things. So the types of things that most worms are going to be scanning for. And of course, you do always have to have a firewall rule enabled to be able to connect your Lavawall to your region's Lavawall servers, and that allows us to do all the patching and logging. And then, as required by PCI and almost any other standard, that there is a default deny rule on the bottom.